Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are continuing our conversation about ADHD. And I have with me today a leading authority in ADHD, no other than Dr. Russell Barkley. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine. He is a clinical scientist, educator, and practitioner. He has published numerous books, rating scales, and clinical manuals, and more than 300 scientific articles and book chapters on ADHD and related disorders. Dr. Barkley has presented more than 800 invited lectures in more than 30 countries, and he has appeared on nationally televised programs, including 60 Minutes, The Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS Sunday Morning, and CNN. And he is here today on the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. We are discussing the key principles for raising a child with ADHD, and he is sharing how ADHD has impacted his family and led to his passion for work in this area. I am absolutely thrilled to be bringing you this conversation.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
All right. So Dr. Barkley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate your time and your support of the work that we are doing to get the information out to everyone about ADHD.
Truly a pleasure, Karen. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to disseminate the science behind ADHD as often as we can.
Absolutely. Now, the fourth edition of your best-selling book, Taking Charge of ADHD, the complete authoritative guide to parents for parents, came out in 2020. And it uses updated research to educate parents about ADHD and addresses all the questions parents might have about ADHD treatment. Now, you are a leading authority on ADHD. How do you define it?
Okay. Well, thank you for acknowledging that. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate your mentioning the book. The companion book to that one is The 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD, which came out about 3 months after that one. So sometime last fall, as I recall. But back to your question, ADHD to me has to be looked at two levels. The first level is the most superficial. That's the one that clinicians tend to use. That's the one that our diagnostic manual tends to present, which is that ADHD is this neurodevelopmental disability. That's an important term we can come back to. But it's a neurodevelopmental problem in the emergence of two mental functions that we all possess. The first is the capacity to pay attention, particularly sustained attention over time, and resist distraction. And the second piece of that is the ability to inhibit inappropriate or excessive action. And there we see both the hyperactivity, but also the verbal disinhibition, the talkativeness, and the generally poor impulse control. So that's kind of a superficial view of ADHD. It's adequate for clinical practice because it simply is setting out what behaviors an individual needs to demonstrate in order for us to render that diagnosis, along with, as you know, the other criteria that go with diagnosis, which we can talk about as well. So level one is this very superficial view of ADHD, and we do that with autism and with others. So here's what a person has to be doing for us to think they have ADHD. And there's 18 of those behaviors in our DSM-5 diagnostic manual. But if you look under the hood, as I call it, if you peer into the brain and its psychological functioning, ADHD is really a disorder of self-regulation. And self-regulation requires the 7 major executive functions that occur in largely the prefrontal area, but in networks throughout the brain that allow us to self-regulate, become independent, become self-governing, think about our future, act with regard to potential future consequences, not just with regard to momentary consequences, which all other animals do, and then to use that capacity to anticipate the future in order to regulate, modify our own behavior to improve our welfare. I mean, so, at level 1, it's a pretty trivial disorder of attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. Under the hood at level 2, it's a massive problem with human self-regulation and the major executive functions. And when you understand that, you are very impressed with just how devastating this disorder can be. It's one of the most impairing disorders we treat in outpatient clinics, impairing virtually every domain of life that an individual enters. So that's how I think of it, is people need to look at it at both levels, the superficial and the under the hood neuropsychological view.
And I like that perspective from those different viewpoints. And I think that people are very much familiar with the inattention and the hyperactivity because it's in the name, embedded in the name. But you talk about the fact that, children with ADHD pay attention to the same things that other children do, but they can't sustain their focus for long. And it seems that inhibition plays a role in that. Can you talk about what that looks like for parents?
Yeah, well, if we break down the inhibitory problem dimension of ADHD, remember it's 2 dimensions, the inattention and the disinhibition, and they're highly correlated with each other. So most people have problems with both dimensions. So if we unpack the inhibitory dimension, what we see is a massive problem with inhibition across every major psychological domain of human action. So let me just go over that. First, we see disinhibited motor action. So the individual is very restless, squirmy, fidgety, touching the environment, very much engaged in a lot of inappropriate and excessive activity. And by the way, the activity that we see, the motor action, is often more rapid, more forceful. Ballistic is the word physical therapists would use for it. So it's very, it's not softened, it's not moderated. There's not this gradual onset and offset. It can be very abrupt, and the movements can change very quickly and often more forcefully. So people often don't appreciate it's not just activity, and a lot of activity, it's often rather forceful activity.
Right.
The second thing, and the DSM recognizes this, is the verbal disinhibition. So there's a lot of excess talking, interrupting others, intruding on conversations, and so on. And so that's represented in the DSM-5 criteria too. But there are 3 aspects to this inhibition problem you mentioned that aren't noted in the DSM-5, but are actually more compelling and certainly contribute to impairment a lot more. So very quickly, the first one of those is cognitive impulsivity. These people do not stop and contemplate thoughts that enter their mind before acting on them. So it's like thought, action, stimulus, response. It reminds me of the Gary Larson cartoon of 2 amoebas, and the wife amoeba is saying to her husband, stimulus, response, stimulus, response. Don't you ever think, well, that's ADHD. The pause that gives us thinking isn't there. So there's very little contemplation about that idea and what's going to happen if I do that and what happened previously. So hindsight and foresight and other executive abilities just don't stand a chance because you're so cognitively impulsive. There's also a distractibility with that cognitive impulsivity. Other thoughts come into mind when you should be focusing on this topic, and instead you're thinking about other things and your mind is being pulled in multiple directions. So they often refer to their mind as as a mess in its organization. The fourth aspect of impulsivity people don't talk much about is a motivational impulsivity. This is very important for clinical planning and clinical practice. People with ADHD show what is called a high time preference, which is to say that they opt for immediate small rewards over the pursuit of delayed rewards, larger rewards, what we would call in our business delay of gratification. So when faced with a choice between, I could have this right now, even though it's rather small and trivial, but it would be fun, or I could turn away from that and pursue this longer goal and get a much larger reward later, they don't. They devalue or discount the delay and the reward that's delayed by how long it's delayed. And although all people do that, We don't value things that are 2 years out versus things that are next week versus things that are occurring next hour. But the discounting of that by people with ADHD is striking. They simply don't value delayed consequences like other people. And that leads to problems with treatment interventions because, you can't set up interventions that have these long lags to consequences in them. You really have to build in a lot of immediate accountability. And then the final impulsivity aspect that isn't in the DSM, but we tried to get it in there, is emotional impulsiveness. People with ADHD show their emotions very quickly, more strongly than other people when they're provoked, and can't recover from those strong emotions as fast as other people. So the self-control of emotion is impaired in people with ADHD. Now, it's important to point out here, we're not talking about a mood disorder here. That's different. And people with ADHD can have a mood disorder. But here we're talking about what comes with ADHD as an inherent feature of it. And that is very impulsive emotions, easily provoked, stronger because they're not being moderated, and harder to get control over when they're elicited. So that's different than a mood disorder. Moods are long-lasting, lasting hours, days, weeks. Moods are cross-situational. Moods are capricious, extreme, and often irrational. We don't understand why the person is feeling manic for the last 4 days. Whereas with ADHD, an emotion is very short duration, unlike a mood. It's often situation-specific. It's provoked by something in the environment. And that means we can understand why you feel the way you do. We would have felt that way too, but we would not have shown it. We would not have disinhibited that strong emotion. We would have tried to quell it, count to 10, go to our happy place, think positive thoughts, worry about what's going to happen if you grab your employer by the lapels because you don't like the feedback you got. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. So it's rational emotion in the sense that others can understand what upset you. It's not reasonable on the other hand because it's not very mature. You're acting like a much younger person in, displaying all of these emotions in response to provocations. And so there's a lot that goes along with that emotional dimension, including it's the best predictor of friendships that you're going to have in your lifetime. It's the best predictor of whether you're going to be able to keep a job or not. It's a predictor of intimate partner relationships, satisfaction, violence in relationships, and so on. So there's a lot on that impulsivity dimension that isn't part of the superficial DSM, but needs to be understood by the public and by clinicians as being just as important. And you need to listen for those things when you do interviews with people and not just pay attention to talking too much and excess movement.
Yeah, and it seems that self-regulation and that emotional control piece is what often gets missed, that it hasn't been traditionally associated with ADHD, and particularly in preschoolers who present with ADHD. And you talk a lot about the fact that, this is kind of a lifelong disorder with a lot of the symptoms manifesting in preschool and continuing through adulthood, although it might look different in adulthood than it does in preschool. But oftentimes that self-regulation piece shows up very early and may even be one of the first signs for particularly younger children.
Truly, that's very true. And although the nature of ADHD changes somewhat with age, that's because the executive functions take up to 30 years to mature. And as each executive function starts to come online, it requires about a decade or more to reach its maturation. But as typical children are getting their sense of self-awareness, their sense of self-restraint, their sense of time, their visual imagery, their internal speech, followed by this capacity to regulate emotion, which then leads us to have self-motivation. And then the pinnacle of executive functioning is the planning and problem solving, which is, I think of it as private play, play in the mind with information. So those are the 7 levels of executive functioning. And so you can see that at any age, the ADHD child is delayed by as much as 30% or more in getting that next executive function. So in the preschool years, it's just a disinhibited, hyperactive kid. But by 5 years of age, it's a child with no sense of time and who can't wait. And by 7 years of age, there's no mental voice to help with guidance and self-regulation. They can't talk to themselves very well. And even if they do, it doesn't guide their language. And it's not internal, it's external verbiage that we see. And then they don't get the ability to manage their emotions, as we just talked about. And that will be followed by a complete lack of self-motivation. If you put them in a situation where there are no consequences for what you've asked them to do, they can't do it. They can't sustain it. That requires self-motivation, where I generate the motivation for getting this done using my executive functions, and they can't do that. And then, of course, the mental planning and problem solving is pretty shot also. So notice how each layer that's added on as a typical person gets that level and that layer, the ADHD person gets yet another deficit added to their self-regulation deficits compared to other people of their age. So there's a growing complexity to ADHD and its deficits with time. But as you pointed out, and I thought that was wonderful, across development, it's still a self-regulation problem. Relative to your age. You can't do the things that the other kids your age or the other adults your age are able to do as well as they do it.
And that's really an important piece that a lot of parents, grapple with and are trying to understand the behaviors they may have even noticed in younger kids, but it's inappropriate for the age of the child. And so that speaks to what you're saying about there being a delay in the development of those cognitive processes and emotional processes, a lot of which are associated with the frontal lobe, which again,
they are.
Is not fully developed.
Well, and contained within your statement is something really important for listeners to appreciate. ADHD is a dimensional disorder, in a sense like autism spectrum or others, but even more so, ADHD is simply the extreme end of the trait of self-regulation. And they happen to not have as much of it as other people. So it's kind of like the trait of height or the trait of intelligence or language ability or athletic ability. We all vary along these dimensions in our natural abilities. And people with ADHD are part of the normal spectrum of the dimension of self-regulation and executive functioning. They just represent the more deficient lower tail of that bell curve, that distribution. And that means that what makes people with ADHD different from the rest of us isn't something qualitative. They're not a different species of human, as Tom Hartman argued when he said they're just hunters left over from the Pleistocene having to live in a farmer's world. It's an interesting metaphor, and it might make you feel good, but it's false. So, it's the lower end of this dimension. And that means that there's more ADHD in the population than we diagnose, because there'll be people who are at the typical range, people who are just a little below that, but not really impaired, but still show some of the symptoms. Then we've got people even more symptomatic, beginning to get a little impairment, but not yet being able to be diagnosed. And then we've got the more extreme group that is very ADHD in their symptoms and very impaired. And that's where we draw the line and make the diagnosis. So people often ask me, where does typical behavior leave off in children and ADHD begin? Because all children can be inattentive and active. It begins where impairment begins, when the environment starts kicking back with multiple adverse consequences. When your child is told for the third time they can't come to this preschool, when neighbors tell you that your child is not allowed in their yard, when relatives invite you for Thanksgiving dinner but say leave them home or find a sitter, where you can't get babysitters because of the disruptiveness of this child. And of course, once you enter the school system, now you're getting feedback from teachers, other parents, coaches, and so on, about your child's misconduct. And you need to pay attention to that, because those consequences, those negative consequences, start to rack up very early and can lead to downstream additional problems if we don't get diagnosis and treatment. So, I love the fact that you focus on the dimensionality of ADHD, and that it's not a category, it's not pregnancy, and it varies in its severity all the way up to what we would think of as more typical levels of attention and inhibition. So all very important for people to understand. It's a dimension.
Absolutely. And I think that dimensionality of ADHD also leads to misunderstanding. It's why I still have parents say, well, doesn't everyone have ADHD? Or don't we all struggle with attention? When in reality,
I hear that a lot, particularly
from
the Scientologists.
Yeah. And that's why I think you emphasizing that threshold is so important, that we all struggle with attention at some points. But it's the point at which it impacts your ability to function and impairs your ability to function in different environments that is really key.
it might help to think of it this way. We all wash our hands, probably, at least 5 times a day during the pandemic, far more than that. Okay. But what happens if you have the compulsion to wash your hands 10 times more than other people? You fear contamination. You wear gloves like Michael Jackson and Howard Hughes, and you can't be so many steps away from a wash basin, and you carry, alcohol gel wipes with you everywhere, and your hands are cracked and bleeding because they're so chapped from all the exposure to cleaning fluids and water. Well, that's what we're talking about here. Yeah, we all wash our hands, but not like that, not to where it is interfering with functioning in various major life activities and leading to harm. And it's the harm that leads us to draw the line and diagnose and treat.
Yes, absolutely. And you, through the work that you've done, obviously you've done extensive research, and you've also worked with thousands of families of children, of parents of children with ADHD. And many have expressed that raising a child with ADHD is challenging. It's frustrating. It's exhausting because kids are frequently off task. They're forgetting what they're supposed to be doing. They're struggling to persist with things that their parents have asked them to do. And you have a new book, 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD, which was recently published. And in your book, one of the things you talk about is the importance of identifying a child's talents and aptitudes. Can you talk about why that's important?
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to do so. And let me just acknowledge your point. ADHD has been shown in research to be as distressing to parents and as exhausting to parents and families as autism spectrum disorder. And that's a serious disorder, but ADHD is as bad or worse. And that's because you're never out of the trenches. You're 24/7 in the parent role, supervising, monitoring, preventing accidental injuries, trying to regulate a dysregulated child. And let me tell you, by the end of the day, it's overwhelming for many of these families because there's never a break. There's no relief or respite that we get with typical children who can play quietly and take a nap and, eat their lunches and have their snacks, without all of this random activity and disruption and inquisitiveness and, and accidents and so on. So it's very important that we acknowledge and empathize with the role that parents have been placed in by the birth of this child into that family. People used to look at families of ADHD children and say, well, look at those parents. They yell more, they scream more, they punish more, they're stressed out. That's where the ADHD is coming from, And back in the 70s, when I entered the field, that was the belief that ADHD arose because of bad parenting. It was very much similar to what we saw in autism 10 or 20 years before that, where we blame mothers for their inaffectionateness leading to their children's autism. I mean, that was outrageous. That was cruel. It was wrong scientifically. And ADHD families have had to weather that same storm, in our culture, being blamed for their children. So, but back to your point, in my book on the 12 principles, where I do talk about things like, this distress and the attitude you have to take toward raising a disabled youngster, I also talk about what it means to try to strive to create a child who can be effective and successful. And in the chapter on the keys to success, what I did was in writing the book, I went back and we looked at the people who succeeded in my longitudinal studies. We looked at the other follow-up studies. We went on the internet and looked at ADHD success stories. You should really Google that because there's a lot of really talented people, celebrities, athletes, and so on with ADHD who have done a lot in spite of their ADHD. But what we saw in all of these was a set of what I call the keys to success. And number one, after accepting your child for who they are, that's an earlier principle, you're a shepherd, not an engineer. You don't get to rebuild your kids. So, part of that is acceptance and compassion. But then number one, appropriate diagnosis and treatment. Number two, identifying aptitudes, often non-traditional. They're not going to be so much in the academic pathway, with academic success and the various forms of academic achievement. That doesn't mean they can't be. You and I both know people who have succeeded in academics, who've gone on to be, professionals, doctors, lawyers, and so on with ADHD, but it's not very common. Ordinarily, the success stories we see are outside the box. And so what you'll see, it'll be art. It'll be performing arts. It'll be athletics or poetry or videography or culinary arts. Or look at Ty Pennington. The guy makes a living out of destroying houses, which he's been doing since he was a child. Let's take a look at Michael Phelps, who was kept in the pool most of his life, and his mother scheduled him every 15 minutes of his life to keep him on the straight and narrow. So, she identified his talent, which was part of their family's athletic giftedness. That family is very athletically talented. People don't realize that. His sisters were Olympians, as swimmers. His father was a professional football player. So there's a lot of good athleticism coming down that pipeline. And they recognized it very early. So, and other people can do that. Maybe it's the fact that your child is selling rebuilt electric parts out of his desk for computers. Oh, entrepreneur, look at that. Or maybe it's the fact that your child just loves creating little short movies with the video function on the cell phone. Well, can we think videography here or movie making? Or maybe it's the fact that your child loves being in the kitchen with you and, making a mess while you're cooking. And so we're thinking culinary arts for this kid, But I mean, there's so much of that. And he's the class clown. Well, there's comedy. Look at Howie Mandel, who's got ADHD, and many other people, not to mention probably Robin Williams, though I think he was probably bipolar as well. But, let's not diagnose at a distance here. The point is that there's a lot of other pathways to success where you can, it's not just about making money, it's about finding a calling in life that's meaningful to you and that you can commit to and be able to support yourself and of course, succeed financially if you can. But look at Richard Branson. This is a guy who was in jail when he was 16 for selling pirated copies of the Beatles' music, and gets bailed out. Parents second mortgage the home, send him over to Vermont to a private school where even the headmaster says to him, Richard, you are so cutting edge and outside the lines here that you're either going to be in prison again or you're going to be a huge success in your life. And luckily it went that way. And he started Virgin Atlantic Records, then Virgin Atlantic Airlines, and now, spacecraft and all of this other stuff that Richard, he's one of the most wealthy individuals on the planet. Look at Justin Timberlake. Look at Adam Levine. There's a great interview with Adam's mother and with Adam in Attitude magazine about, what he had to go through. And he's got a YouTube video called Own It, about learning to accept and own your ADHD and then find ways to work with it, in these non-traditional pathways. But you got to own it. You can't deny it. And, he's gone back on medication and he's quite the success story. As you know, he's got many enterprises besides Maroon 5 and The Voice and so on. And so just look at each of these success stories and what you will see is a non-traditional aptitude that their parents then did step 3, which is find resources in the community that further develop and promote that aptitude. Michael Phelps' mom found one of the best swim coaches in the U.S. at the Baltimore Athletic Club. Hurrah! She did that. And, people have helped, computer programmers get extra help with computer programming language if they're going to move into the IT space. So, number 3 is let's really develop that non-traditional aptitude. Number 4, you're in their corner all the time. You are their safety net. You are the unconditional regard. You never turn your back on these kids. We do not do tough love. They know that you are there 100% of the time. That doesn't mean there aren't consequences. And it doesn't mean that you accept everything they do as wrong and excuse it. But it does mean you don't abandon them. You don't reject them. You are there for them. And on top of that, of course, there is the need to provide a safety net for them. And that is that you may have to back up and provide, the medical care, the insurance plans, the dental care. You may be the one who has to go to bat for them when they get themselves into trouble, like, Richard Branson's parents bailed him out when they mortgaged the house. So, those are like the 5 keys. You put those together, you're going to have a much better chance of your child having a successful and effective life. But that's not going to happen if you focus on school. You got to do well in school. You got to make me look good there. You got to get those A's. You got to be, have excellence in school. And I tell parents to throw that idea out. We'll pay homage to school. We'll get you through. But let's look at other ways that this kid can succeed in addition or instead of that.
Absolutely. And that's really great advice for so many parents. And I think that you also, by focusing on, again, the talents, and you talk about be a shepherd, not an engineer, you also help parents think about their priorities. And I think you talk about that in the book as well. Get your priorities straight, and also throw away those unrealistic expectations with respect to good parenting and perfect parenting and how to support a child with ADHD. Because, one of the things, we initially talked about are all the struggles that kids with ADHD face, but then now we've moved to a place where there are a lot of things that they can do, and there are a lot of opportunities for them to excel. And at the same time, there are a lot of opportunities for parents to develop their empathy and to practice forgiveness, like you mentioned in the book, and to rise to the challenge of raising a child with ADHD.
Quite a challenge too, and indeed it is. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Karen. I mean, normal parents are 80% of the commands and directives that we give to kids are what I call busy bee commands. They're not essential for development. They might be important for helping to keep a clean house and have it function smoothly and have predictable routines. But they're not all that developmentally important. And in the book I talk about making your bed. Do you really want to have a fight on a school morning about making your bed? Is that the priority right now, or is getting your child up, dressed, fed, making sure their hygiene's good, their clothing's good, and sending them out the door with a message of love and support? Those are your priorities. And, who gives a darn about the bed? Southern Living is not coming by to shoot a photo display of your home later on. So close the door. We'll clean it Saturday when there's time to do it. And there isn't this, drop dead hard deadline of getting out the house, off to work with kids in school the way there is on a school morning. So I tell parents, would you just jettison the normal, busy bee, busy hands or happy hands crap, and instead concentrate on the priority and keep that goal in mind. And you'll be, first of all, you'll be eliminating a lot of conflict because you're not trying to fight all these fires. Your home will be happier. Your child will like you better, of course. And you will be concentrating on what's developmentally crucial as opposed to what is actually trivial.
And it seems that when you focus on that, you also cultivate that parent-child relationship, which is often strained when you're raising a child with ADHD. And you also talk about the fact that parents need to touch more and talk less, which reminds me of a line from Hamilton.
Indeed. What doesn't?
Exactly.
So much goes on in that play. It's
I know.
like, oh my God. Yeah, indeed. Well, it's important for parents, I think, to really grasp that idea. Your relationship to this child is one of the most, if not the most important thing you need to sustain. And as I said, it isn't school. We'll pay homage to school, but I'll be darned if I'm going to sacrifice my relationship for, school success. Because this kid's going to hate you. As I wrote in Taking Charge in the very opening chapter entitled "Help Me, I'm Losing My Child," which is the story of a mother who did put all her eggs in that academic basket and was just, constantly on this kid with tutoring and working with him on homework and trying to get those good grades. And nothing else was more important than that. And gradually her son pulled away from her. He wanted to spend less time with her, less recreational leisure, affectionate time, cuddling time, and whenever she's suggesting doing so, he didn't want any part of this because she had become like bridezilla when it came to, getting homework done, just this incessant of a person around schoolwork, homework, grades, and granted, her heart was in the right place. She thought that this is how you succeed in life, and I need to prepare him for life. But what she lost sight of is that there are many roads to Rome. There are many ways to succeed, and we need all of them, not just the academic route. And that's why she came to me that day. She was losing her child. She was losing a crucial relationship, and at some gut level, she knew that she was losing it and that this was wrong. And we had to right that ship and correct that problem. And we did it by de-emphasizing school and making other aspects of family life and your relationship as or more important than those other things. So that is vital, because if you lose that relationship, you lose what Stephen Covey referred to as your emotional and social bank account. He likens parenting to creating a emotional bank account with your child in which you have to be making deposits of respect, approval, praise, recognition, honor, integrity. And all at the time you treat your child with those ideas in mind, you are making deposits into this bank account in their mind. And then there's going to come a time where you do need to correct them. You do need to hold them accountable. You do need to give them some feedback around something they may not have done right. And you'll be able to do that and still have a very good relationship because you can make withdrawals from the bank account because it's full, it's huge, and there's respect. But man, if you aren't making those deposits over time and you have to make those withdrawals with criticism and correction and discipline, you're going to lose this kid because there's no bank account. They want nothing to do with you and they're going to find ways to avoid you. So to me, that is a very, very important aspect of what you're talking about here. And that is emphasize the relationship, keep it personal. If you have something to say, you go to your child, you touch them, you get eye contact, you say it in a business-like tone of voice, very brief, right? Whether it's praise, whether it's correction, whether it's an instruction, and you'll get somewhere with them. But on top of that, you got to be making those deposits into that emotional bank account with a lot of approval and respect and recognition and praise and just simple positive feedback about what your child does that's pretty good. And stop overlooking all of that good stuff and focusing on the negative, the warts, so to speak, because you're going to destroy this relationship and you're going to regret it the rest of your life.
And so many children get that negative feedback from school. So it's the perfect opportunity for parents to really, again, fill that child's cup with that positive regard that you talk about in your book that is so essential to the child's well-being and emotional well-being. Now, I just think that your books are exceptional. And the 12 principles that you've outlined, I mean, it's really tremendous strategies for parents to help them cope and manage their child's ADHD in a meaningful and thoughtful way and the thoughtful approaches. And they're practical.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate that. First of all, I do want to acknowledge the help of Chris Benton, who is, one of my co-authors on many of my trade books. Chris is a writer out of Chicago, and we hire her and work with her and even make her a co-author on some of my books because she contributes so much to making the text come alive and making people connect to it. I bring the science to the content, but Chris brings the style, and I just want to call out to Chris with this and acknowledge my having worked with her for over 20 years on making these books as good as they can be. Now, in the book, as you mentioned, we do talk about a lot of things, and the motive behind the book that I want people to know is, I'm turning 72 this year. I can see the end of my career coming. I can see the end of my life coming. I'm a long-term thinker. That doesn't bother me. But what it did do was to motivate me over a year ago to sit down and ask, out of the hundreds of thousands of research papers that are out there, and I read all of them every week when they get published, out of the thousands of families I've worked with, out of the research that I have done personally on ADHD, can we reduce it to these golden principles, if you will, these core nuggets of information that everybody really needs to know? And I sat down and I took a long time and boiled down what I thought were the crucial ideas that if you know nothing else, know these 12, and you'll be doing as good a job in raising an effective child as if you had read tons of more trade books and research papers. So that's why I wrote it. It's kind of, I don't want to call it a swan song, but you never know. But I really just felt like if I'm going to, step down now eventually and leave the field, what am I leaving? What's the legacy? And can we summarize that in a very digestible way to improve the care and well-being of these people and their families? So, that's why I did it. And it was easy to write because I kept my eyes on that prize. What's crucial? What do we need to know?
And that's exactly what it gives parents, because I think that you've done such a great job of explaining ADHD to so many parents, educators, and other clinicians. And this book gives parents kind of the next step. Now that I know what it is, what do I do? How do I help my child? And I think it just outlines beautifully how parents can continue to support their children who have diagnosis of ADHD. And I imagine that in addition to the research, that you've learned a lot from the families that you've worked with. And can you think about some lessons that you've learned from families? Because I've read some of the anecdotes in your book, and I imagine when you work with thousands of families, you are learning as well from them.
Yeah. Well, I've mentioned one lesson that was so impressive to me with that mother articulating so clearly the value of parent-child relationships over all else. And a lot of people don't focus on that, particularly when in clinical practice and especially in schools. So that was one. But certainly there are others in the book that I talk about that come out of this. And by the way, ADHD was in my family. I lost a twin brother in a car accident due to his ADHD-related risk-taking. And so it's personal to me. It isn't just the end of a profession. It's having gone through a period of time in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, where my twin brother got no help. My parents were blamed. He was blamed. He quit school at 16 because there just was nothing there. There was no special ed. There was no ADHD diagnosis. There were no clinics. There were no medications. And boy, when you grow up with that, you just want to make sure that doesn't happen again, and that the right services and the right ideas are out there to keep other families from experiencing what my family, and especially my brother, had to go through. So, part of that is infused in the book is how personal it is for me, and why I have a passion for this beyond just my intellectual curiosity about this disorder and its underpinnings. And then, of course, another thing that I learned from families that I'll leave you with is that, ADHD is the worst disorder you can have and manage yourself in time, which is why I invented the term for my book called time blindness. Think of ADHD as time blindness. Your child cannot deal with the past and the future the way other people can deal with it because they don't have a normal sense of time and timing and timeliness. And so we have to stop stuffing time down their throats with 30 minutes to do this, 1 hour to do that, 2 weeks to get that done. You know it as well, that as we get older, our lives become increasingly time sensitive as we grow up. And it's one of the things that when we say that childhood was a period of innocence, what we're really talking about is it was innocent of time. Because once time gets its hooks into you, your life becomes consumed with time management. And yes, to be effective, you have to pay attention to time and deadlines and promises and commitments and organization over time. And all of that matters. But the first thing to realize is your child can't do that. That's a neurological defect. And if you'll view ADHD as time blindness, you'll approach all of these time-sensitive tasks in a very different way than you would if you thought your child was just like any other kid and is simply doing this to make you angry, or simply a scofflaw who's a couch potato who doesn't care and could wake up and smell the coffee tomorrow if he wanted to, but it's kind of a lifestyle choice he's making, which of course is patently untrue. So, that was another thing that came out of our clinical work with families, is that time is ruined by this disorder. And if you don't recognize that, you're going to look at this through the lens of morality and personality failure, and people just don't care and aren't motivated, because that's how we look at people who don't do things in time, on time, over time. They're lazy. They don't care. And boy, let me tell you, the moral judgment that flies from that conclusion, it's pretty devastating for these people. No wonder they're so demoralized by the time they're teens and young adults. They've been hearing, this moral judgment all their life. And, understanding ADHD as a problem with self-control and time and executive functioning and so on, really puts it in the realm of medical science and gets it out of the realm of morality and moral, denigration that is so devastating to these people. So thank you for asking.
And I appreciate what you just said about moral judgment. And I really believe that the work that you're putting out there is really it's continuing to decrease that moral judgment, because you're increasing understanding. And that's part of what I want to continue to do. And it's one of the reasons why I asked you to come on the podcast today. And I really appreciate you sharing your personal story about how ADHD has impacted you and your family, and just for sharing your expertise with so many families, educators, and clinicians. It's been an absolute honor to have you on the podcast today and to have you come on and share this information and for your support of Child Nexus and the work that we're doing. So thank you so much. And and I know that this is not your swan song. There's much more, I'm sure, that is going to come out of you. And I appreciate and I look forward to it.
Thanks so much, Karen. And I'm deeply honored that you even gave me a chance to talk about this and to get that science out there to change people's lives. So thank you for doing that.
You may not know that when I was thinking about starting Child Nexus, I reached out to Dr. Barkley about my idea, and he was incredibly supportive. He actually gave me permission to republish some of his ADHD fact sheets on our website. Not only is he incredibly knowledgeable and clearly passionate about ADHD and the work that he does, he is also extremely generous and gracious. I encourage you to visit his website, russellbarkley.org, where he has a number of resources for families, educators, and clinicians. And be sure to get a copy of his latest book, 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD. I hope you got some value from this episode. I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.